judging by the size of the crowd, that Doug doesn't really need any introduction. But I am going to tell you a little bit about it. Like many of the faculty here in BU's mechanical engineering, Doug followed a non-direct path to mechanical engineering. So he has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from UNH and master's and PhDs in polymer science and engineering from University of Massachusetts. And he did a postdoc with Howard Stone at Princeton. And then he started his junior faculty career at Virginia Tech. And almost exactly 5 years ago, he interviewed for faculty positions 4 years ago. 4 years ago.
Yeah, 4.
4 years ago.
4.
He interviewed for a faculty position here. Actually came and gave a seminar, and we were just very taken by that. And so it's been a wonderful thing for mechanical engineering. Doug, every time I sit down with Doug, I learn something interesting about him, but I have to say that a couple of things that I'm particularly impressed with is his ability to become an invited visiting professor in very interesting places, including Copenhagen, Rome, Paris, Oxford, and even Finland. He has a number of awards, including the NSF Career Award, and particularly interesting to me and probably to his students is that he won the Outstanding New Mechanics Educator Award in 2015 from ASCE. He is also enjoys rock climbing and is a musician, or used to anyway. And without further ado, let me turn this over to Doug. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Alice, and thanks everyone for coming. Today I want to talk about shaping slender structures. And I wanted to start with a quote, and this is a quote, it was in the obituary of Augustus Love. Augustus Love, for people who study elasticity, he wrote a monumental book, the Treatise of the Mathematical Theory of Elasticity, in the late 1800s that's still used today by many researchers. And this is a quote by Edward Milne, the famous cosmologist, in the obituary of Augustus Love, saying, "Elasticity is a subject that offers the least attraction and appears completely devoid of romance." And so if you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope to convince you that Milne was wrong. And there's plenty of romance in elasticity. So where does this come from, and how do we take some of these old ideas and make them new again? So one of the really old ideas is what happens if you take an object that's got a hole in it and you pull on it? And this is a classical elasticity problem in which you reduce this thing to 2D and you just say, okay, let's figure out what the stress is going to be in this structure. And if you relax that assumption that it's in 2D and you just say, okay, well, let's let this thing bend, let's let this thing live in 3D, what you see is that you already start to get really complex deformations. So here's a sheet, and we're going to pull on it, and you can see kind of a hump in the middle of this sheet. As parts of the sheet are lifted, parts of the sheet are rotated, and this little crack starts to add a lot of interesting complexity to this structure. And if you start to think about how these cracks can interact with each other, for instance, if you put multiple cracks on this sheet in different arrangements, can you start to do anything useful with that? And so one thing we did, kind of building on these ideas, is we would put cracks in sheets in different patterns, and we started to try to create kind of tiny actuators, ultra lightweight, we call them kirigami, cuts in sheets actuators, in which if you take this structure with these cuts and you pull on it, you can generate kind of basic linear actuation, things like lift, in which your sheet will pop out of the plane. And you can extend this thing to vertically out of the plane here as you pull in this direction. By putting your cuts in a different orientation, you can get stuff like pitch, in which you can take aspects of the sheet and cause it to rotate. People have used ideas like this as a way to, you put solar panels on those sheets there, you pull it and have these kind of solar panels deform and track the sun. Lift, pitch, yaw, this was the trickiest one. You get a tiny amount of rotation of this structure in the middle here as you pull on it. And even something as complex as roll, in which you were pulling on this thing vertically and we're taking a part of the sheet. And just by putting cuts in a particular pattern, you can cause this thing to spin around. So let me pass around a couple of these so you can play for them and see if you can figure out how you, how you should arrange these cuts to get them to do certain things. But what's particularly interesting is that only the geometry here matters. So we did some math and we showed that the thickness of the sheet doesn't play a role. So if you can just take these cut patterns and make them in the thinnest sheets possible, you'll get the same deformations. So for instance, you could take these all the way down to 2D, look at something like a graphene sheet here with a single cut on it, and you pull on it, and you see the same deformations that you saw in that continuum material on the previous slide. Here's another 2D material, MOS2, in which we've made the same cut pattern that gives you a pitch-like rotation. And you see that you're able to generate rotation in these 2D materials where the only thing that matters is the geometry of these structures. So let's think about some other classical problems in elasticity and how we can kind of make them new again, and perhaps, I guess, add romance to them. So perhaps the most classical problem in elasticity is this problem posed by Galileo in the mid-1600s. This is often credited as being the beginning of elasticity theory, in which he asked the question, you have this wooden cantilever sticking out of a wall, and you hang a weight off of it. How much weight can you hang before it breaks? And so we're used to these ideas now of thinking about how thin things deform and bend as you apply weights to them. But it's perhaps less obvious if you kind of combine this idea with something like a fluid. So another really, really classical problem in mechanics, dating back perhaps to Da Vinci, who observing in his notebooks this capillary action, is how high will fluid rise if you kind of put it within a straw. And as that straw diameter gets bigger, the fluid rises less and less high. And so the question that you can ask is, well, what happens if the walls of this straw are not rigid, but they're flexible? And what you see is you have a bunch of flexible sheets here. They're sitting in a bath of fluid. And if you just pull these sheets out of this fluid, you get a coalescence of these sheets. And this is the exact same behavior that happens when you take a paintbrush and you dip it in a bucket of paint, or for those of you with hair, when you get out of the shower and they stick together. And so this is an interesting phenomenon, but it's also a really practically important phenomenon, because for those of you who make micro or nanostructures, and you try to remove your resin from these structures, what you find is that if you try to make really, really tall, high aspect ratio features, they always collapse upon themselves. And they might collapse in interesting patterns, but nonetheless they collapse, and they collapse for the same physics here, which is this elastocapillary phenomenon, in which elasticity and surface tension combine to bring materials close together. The question we asked was, well, what happens if that fluid doesn't just exist on the outside of the structure, but is able to be pulled into the structure? And so what we did is we took a couple of sheets that are soft rubber materials. So this is silicon rubber. This is a bath of silicon oil. And we're going to dip them in the silicon oil, and we'll expect these things to coalesce due to elastocapillarity. But then because these materials are compatible with each other, they'll induce a swelling in this structure. And the deformation changes dramatically. So instead of just coalescing due to surface tension, what you see is that swelling, or in this case a differential swelling, causes really significant bending deformations. Now this is something you don't often see in structures in your day-to-day life. And so does it matter? And that's a fair question. But if you start to dig a little bit deeper, what you find is that a lot of soft materials will absorb a small amount of fluid, and will, if they're constricted from deforming in this manner, they'll develop really large stresses. And these stresses can be catastrophic. So here's an example of a fuel cell membrane that absorbed too much fluid due to swelling, caused bending and induced deformations, and delaminated and basically buckled and completely destroyed this device here. Due to a combination of capillarity and swelling and bending, you see that these kind of the stresses that can build up in these structures can really destroy well-architectured materials. Another example is that these types of things like swelling of soft materials can really dramatically affect basic problems like adhesion. Even tiny droplets, what we showed here is that even a droplet of solvent between two soft materials, when you pull on those materials, a tiny droplet of solvent can decrease the amount of force you need to separate them by over an order of magnitude with just a tiny, tiny drop of material. And so this kind of coupling of solids and fluids and swelling and elasticity kind of raises a lot of new questions as we start to engineer soft materials. So one more example of kind of coupling a classical problem with perhaps a more modern concern, which is coupling this elastic deformation of a structure with granular materials. And so these are strange materials if you've never worked with granular materials because, right now you're looking at the outflow of a silo. So you have these kind of cylindrical discs pouring out of an opening. And if you keep your eyes on the colored discs here, what you'll find is that as they make their way to their opening, the kind of order of all of these structures changes the behavior of this granular material from something that flows like a liquid to something that jams like a solid. And now it's clogged, and now the forces that this structure will exert on a beam are completely different from the forces that flowing material did. And this is another problem that's really relevant to a lot of different concerns. For instance, like root growth. How does a chickpea root grow in soil? How does it find its way? Does it go towards nutrients, or does it go away from really, really stiff areas? And work that has been done has shown that these roots, as they try to grow, the forces exerted on them completely change whether or not they'll grow down or they'll try to find a different route away. There's so many open questions in this area, and what we were interested in was saying, well, what if we could drive this deformation? How, if we want to, for instance, make like a smart needle, something that you could inject into a material and control where it goes, how do you understand this coupling of the flexible structure and the material that it's deforming in to get it to deform in the way you want? These questions made up the overall kind of layout of our NSF Career Award, in which we were trying to understand the combination of elastic structures within complex or fragile media. So granular media, wet granular media, really deformable granular media, or moving all the way along the spectrum to soft tissues and gels. And we were trying to figure out, can we actively deform a structure within these complex medias and get them to bend and twist in the ways we want. And so we're still working pretty actively in this area, and we've learned a lot already. And one of the things we've learned is that as you inject a material into a bunch of grains, after a while, this structure has no idea what's happening way down here. It has no idea what's happening to this structure here. So when you're trying to deform this material within this complex media, you really have to consider kind of just a particular length scale here. And as we started to look more at what the granular material is doing, we see this constant trade-off between granular material forcing the elastica into a place that it doesn't want to go, and then the elastica exerting a force back and doing things like dislocating or dislodging a bead from this granular material. So there's a lot that we just fundamentally need to understand about how these interactions behave. But these kind of questions led us to starting to think about, can we use elastogranular structures as a way to build objects? So this is recent work that sparked a collaboration with Skylar Tibbetts and myself, in which we're trying to see now, can we take rocks and strings and pour them into load-bearing structures, things that can be completely reversible, no adhesive, just rocks and string, and we can make pillars and walls in a way in which we can kind of, you can think of like emergency structure formation. And so this is something that we're just about to get kick-started on now, kind of taking these fundamental questions of how granular materials and elastic structures behave and use them to kind of create new engineered structures. So as you can see from all of these kind of motivating and example problems that I've given you, my research group largely centers around this question: how do objects change shape? And in particular, what I want this talk to focus on is two things. Can we create shape-shifting structures? Can we create structures that we can say, start here, apply a stimulus, and have this thing switch from here to here? There's a lot of reasons why you might want shape-shifting structures. One of the most kind of problems that's been around for a long time in the aerospace industry is, for instance, morphable wings. But I'm interested in general, can we just create structures in which we can kind of tunably and actively change their shape? And in particular, this talk is going to focus on understanding how these structures undergo elastic instabilities as they morph from one shape to another. And maybe we can utilize those elastic instabilities, or maybe we have to design our structures to avoid them. Here's an example of kind of the storage and release of large amounts of elastic energy. This is the mantis shrimp, in which you see this saddle-like shape here, which allows it to store a massive amount of energy. And then as this claw is released, it can really rapidly and quickly exert a significant amount of force on its prey. So we're focused on how do objects change shape, and the overall thing that we're going to talk about today is how we can use natural curvature as a stimulus to deform slender structures. So first things first, what's natural curvature? So natural curvature is a catch-all term. You take an object, you do something to it, and it bends. The amount that it bends is the natural curvature of this object. So what does this? Many, many things do this. If you have, for instance, differential growth, so you have some part of a soft material where the outside's growing more than the inside, it'll induce curvature change. Differential swelling, like those two fibers that we dipped in the beam. There was fluid on the inside, not on the outside. That induced a curvature change. You saw that bending. Proteins within the cell membrane, or proteins on a lipid vesicle, will induce local changes to the curvature of that. In this field, this would be known as a spontaneous curvature. And perhaps the most kind of classical example is differential heating, or for instance, deposition of a hot metallic film onto something like a silicon wafer, which if you do it incorrectly will cause that thing to bow. So this is natural curvature. And it occurs in a wide range of different biological and industrial scenarios. So here's an example of that pesky pollen grain, which it's so kind of wisely as it's released will prevent itself from drying out by curving into this kind of weird little maybe burrito or taco shape here. And so this thing kind of starts like a spherical shell. To resist drying, there's a differential swelling or differential drying in this case, in which this thing will go from being kind of spherical-like to kind of spindle-like. Here's a really interesting example. This is a Volvox embryo. This is a multicellular organism that, when it's formed, all of its cilia, or its swimmers, are on the inside of this spherical shell. That's a problem, because in order for this thing to move, it has to completely turn itself inside out. And the way that it turns itself inside out is that there's a natural curvature that exists on this tiny hole opening, and you can't even really see the hole there, but it ends up being, I think, at this point here, which propagates through. And this tiny hole exerts a significant amount of natural curvature and basically turns itself inside out. This occurs in a bunch of different morphogenetic problems. This is the Drosophila. This is a type of fruit fly which develops a natural curvature during its embryo development, which causes it to kind of this invagination to form along the structure. And this idea of natural or spontaneous curvature plays a huge role in deforming things like, for instance, blood cells, in which the shape of these cells can be really attributed to changes in the spontaneous curvature on this structure. And perhaps the most kind of fun example of this is the snap through of the Venus flytrap, in which differential swelling as it pulls fluid through its leaves causes a snap through instability, which enables this prey to capture this plant to capture its prey. Other examples include, as I mentioned before, this deposition of a hot metal film onto a silicon wafer. This dates back to over 100 years with Stoney studying the bowing of a silicon wafer. For those of you who take too much pride in your record collection, if you leave your records out in the sun, you'll see this warping phenomenon in which this top part expanded more than the bottom, and it kind of develops a bow-like shape. And there's examples from residual stress due to growth. So this is a example of a cylindrical shell. I think this is part of an esophagus that due to residual stresses that formed during the growth of this structure, if you just take this and cut it and you measure the opening angle, you can get a sense of how much residual stress is in this structure. And from my perspective, this idea of residual stress changing curvature is analogous to this kind of concept that we're trying to wrap into this term of natural curvature. So here we have natural curvature, and it's just a stimulus that changes the curvature of an object. And what we want to do is kind of take all of these different problems from different areas in mechanics, biology, and whatnot, and come up with a general framework for how do we deal with what a stimulus like this does to change the shape of a thin object, like a plate, a cylinder, or a spherical shell. So how do we do this? How do we create this in the lab, and how do we study this? Well, in our lab, we developed this technique called residual swelling, where we take a polymer, a cross-linked elastic rubber. We take another polymer that's almost exactly the same, a cross-linked elastic rubber, except this one is completely dry, and this one has some residual uncross-linked polymer chains in it. These things here. If you put these two things together, it's kind of like sticking a dry sponge to a wet sponge. You stick a dry sponge to a wet sponge, fluid from the wet sponge will migrate into the dry sponge. It'll cause the pink part to shrink. It'll cause the green part to get bigger. And this is residual swelling, because you're swelling the structure with residual material that's left in this pink polymer here. And so what we do is we make a thin beam. You can't really tell, but the bottom half of this beam is green. The top half of this beam is pink. We basically form a bilayer of this green and pink material, and we watch how this curvature evolves as a function of time. And this is our way of inducing a curvature into a soft material. So what's residual swelling? So it helps to know a little bit about what swelling is. And so swelling, what you can think about is you're taking the combination of two different kind of energetic things. One is contributions to the free energy due to elasticity, so the strain energy being stored in a material. And the second is you have to consider a mixing component, which is to say, how much energy does it cost for these free chains to mix and intermingle with that elastic network? In the limit of really small strains, you can develop a poroelastic model for swelling. And this was developed by Maurice Biot in the 1940s to understand soil mechanics, in which you treat the soil as an elastic structure and the fluid as your kind of swelling solvent, and you can study things like how soil will consolidate. For larger strains, like for instance taking a hydrogel, which can change volume by hundreds of %, you have to do a little bit more work, and you have to consider both finite strains, you have to consider that there's an infinite bath of fluid, and you have to think about this solvent as a small, maybe water molecule. This gives rise to a theory known as stress diffusion swelling. And what we're interested in is something similar, which may or may not have finite strains. There's only a small amount of fluid there, so it's not infinite. And the solvent changes, in which we don't have a small molecule anymore, we have a polymer change. So that changes things. So we can use this to develop a theory of residual swelling, in which the difference between here and here is that in these larger strains, considering the polymer chain as the solvent, the swelling changes the elasticity of your structure. And that's important, and that's what makes the problem hard. And so what we've done is we've constructed a way of looking at kind of, you stick these two materials together. If you were to dry them out, they would have this shape. And so if you consider the swelling or the flow of material from here to here, you can figure out what the deformed shape would be. And this is kind of a 3D large object. But if you do this with a 2D object, you get that bending beam that I showed you before. So that's the material science aspect to what residual swelling is. The mechanics aspect is kind of straightforward. You take a beam, and you take a green part and a pink part, and you stick them together, and the green part wants to get bigger, the pink part wants to shrink. This kind of reminds you of a classical problem by Timoshenko in the heating of a bimetallic strip. If these two things are stuck together, the only way this is possible is if your object bends. And so this is what gives rise to this natural curvature. When you do this for a plate, so this is kind of, I don't want to say trivial, but kind of trivial in terms of understanding going from here to here. When you do this with a plate or a shell, it's trying to do the same thing. It's trying to take this pink and the green plate here. The pink one's going to shrink, the green one's going to expand. And what this stimulus wants to do is take this bilayer and bend it into a sphere. And that's why, and this is where it gets tricky, because geometry plays a role, and geometry messes things up. The reason why geometry messes things up is because you can look at something called the Gaussian curvature of an object. So for instance, the Gaussian curvature is just, in the simplest terms, going to be the product of the two principal curvatures of this surface. So for a sheet of paper, it's this curvature in this direction multiplied by this curvature. This thing's flat, it's just 0. For a soccer ball, you get positive curvature here, positive curvature here. The product of those two positive numbers is going to be a positive number, and so you get a positive Gaussian curvature. And similarly, for something like a Pringle or a saddle, you get one curvature in one direction, one in the other. So you have a negative curvature. The reason why this is important is because there's a fundamental theorem in geometry that says you can't switch between no curvature and positive curvature, or negative curvature and positive curvature, or negative curvature and 0 curvature. You can't switch between any of these things without stretching. And we know this to be true. We know that it's very easy to take a thin sheet of paper and to just roll it into a cylinder, or to roll it into a cone. And that's because we're looking at the product of these two curvatures. So the product of curvature here and no curvature here is 0. The product of curvature here and no curvature here is 0. We didn't change the Gaussian curvature, so this is easy to do. If we want to try to change the curvature, you have to stretch. And this is why we have terrible maps. Because the Earth is a sphere, and we want to put that sphere onto a sheet of paper, and the only way you can do that is by picking parts of that spherical geometry and stretching them, which is why Antarctica and Greenland look huge anytime you look at a traditional kind of map, or at least the maps that I grew up with. So you can't change curvature of a structure without stretching. Okay, so that's the geometric perspective. But mechanics adds another complexity to it. Mechanics says, well, you can just kind of write down the energy required to stretch an object or compress an object and compare it with the energy required to bend an object. What you see here is that there's an energy term, a strain energy, which goes linearly with the modulus of the material. It goes with the square of the strain, so how much you're trying to stretch it. And it goes linearly with the thickness. Your bending energy goes linearly with your modulus, so that's the same. It goes with the square of how much you're curving it, and it goes to the cube of the thickness. And this is where the problem comes in, because if you compare the energy required to stretch an object with the energy required to bend an object, it's always so much easier to bend an object than it is to stretch it, which is why it's so easy to just roll this thing up into a cylinder. But it's nearly impossible to stretch this and elongate it. It's because the energy required to bend this object is so small, and because this term basically goes to 0. So thin structures want to bend and they don't want to stretch. Well, what happens if you try to stretch or compress a thin structure? Well, we know what happens. So if I take a soda can and I try to shrink it into a shorter soda can, that doesn't work. This desire to bend over stretching is why we see these large elastic instabilities form in thin structures. Thin structures want to bend in any way possible. They don't want to stretch. When you try to stretch them, they'll find another way to bend, and they'll bend by buckling. And these instabilities complicate matters even more. Because even if you do all your homework and you solve the problem of how much weight can this soda can handle, maybe it's 50 pounds, and you do such a great job and you put 50 pounds on it and nothing happens and you feel really happy about yourself, these structures want to bend so badly that any slight perturbation on this structure causes them to catastrophically fail. They're so sensitive, and we'll come back to this idea, but they're so sensitive to any imperfection that any tiny amount of bending will cause this thing that's doing a good job of holding up a large amount of mass to catastrophically fail. And so here we can kind of put everything together. So we have swelling, which is when we have fluid trying to stretch a material. Mechanics tells us that thin things don't like to stretch. Geometry tells us that you can't change curvature without stretching. And all of that together leads to instabilities, which is when you're going to get bending when you're not expecting to get bending. So I want to take these ideas and try to come up with a framework for describing how thin structures will deform in response to a natural curvature. And so we need a way to write the energy of that thin structure. The way we write this energy is going back to a shell theory written down by Coiter, which considers the elastic energy of a shell to depend only on its material properties and its metric tensors. And you get a form that looks sort of like this. You have a strain energy that can be split up into something that contributes the amount of energy that requires to stretch it and the amount of energy that requires to bend it. All right, so what are these metric tensors? Well, they're different measures of what's happening on the surface. So in the one case, if you take a thin sheet and you say, I'm going to measure all the distances on this surface, your first metric tensor, A, tells you how all of those distances change on the surface. If I stretch it, it tells me how does this metric tensor change as I go from here to here. It measures changes in distance on that surface. Your curvature tensor says at every point, how curved am I? I do something to it, and then I measure how that curvature at that point changes. So here it's not curved at all, and here I've curved it in some amount. You put these things into this energy here, and you end up with this kind of ugly looking thing down here, which is not as bad as it looks. This is a strain energy that's composed of a stretching part and a bending part. The stretching part is made up of two invariants, as we would expect. An energy should be made up of invariants. And these invariants describe kind of squares of the stretching strains. So this is, you can kind of think of this as like that epsilon that I showed you a few slides ago. You have like an epsilon squared and another kind of epsilon squared. And this term here is made up of two other invariants, which are invariants of the curvature strains. So again, you have kind of a kappa squared, a curvature squared, and another kind of kappa squared here. So this strain energy tells you stretching and bending. Stretching measures changes in local distances on the surface, and bending measures changes in local curvature on the surface. So there's been a lot of work lately in the last 5 or 10 years or so trying to understand how to describe shell or thin structures that are not deforming in a traditional way. You know, there's been, for the last 50 or 100 years, we've thought about structures and you take an object and you poke on it. And now we're trying to kind of use some ideas of elasticity to understand what happens if you take an object and you say, let it grow. Let it grow locally. You take a cylinder and you say, let the top of the cylinder grow. You take a spherical shell and you say, let's understand how this thing will change shape as parts of it grow and parts of it shrink. And this is challenging because you don't have a kind of a traditional way to do mechanics. You don't have an energy and a work term. What's the work being done? And so what was developed was what's called a theory of NonEuclidean shells. Okay. What does that mean? Basically what it boils down to is if you have a growing object and you want to measure how much energy was stored as this thing grew from point A to point B, what do you compare it to? In the Coiter's theory, you just compare it to its initial shape. You say, here's my new shape, compare it to my old shape, and there's some change there, so there should be some energetic cost to that. But if you have a growing object, what shape do you compare it to? As this thing grows over time, it's changing, it's deforming quite a bit. It's not obvious what the reference state is. And so what this non-Euclidean shell theory said was, well, we should compare the current shape to some imaginary shape that has no stress at all in it, some completely stress-free shape. And that completely stress-free shape depends on what we did to the structure. Did we try to grow it isometrically, or did we try to make it bend and curve in different areas? And going through the math here changes that equation I had on the last slide ever so slightly, only by these two little red terms here. This is a tricky thing to deal with because you have to figure out, okay, I have this shell, it's growing. How does that growth feed into these things here? What do I do with these terms? And so what we set out to do was to try to make this something that was more mechanically tractable, something that was more physical. And so what we did is we limited ourselves to these types of deformations. These are called isometric deformations. Deformations that don't stretch the object or don't change the metric. And that corresponds to things like this, taking a sheet of paper and rolling it into a cylinder. And what we found is when you just focus on deformations like this, taking an object that's maybe initially curved and changing the curvature by kind of adding some swelling or adding some heating, just nicely additively changes the overall curvature of your object. This is a really simple realization. We saw it experimentally, and it led to kind of a bit of a breakthrough theoretically, in which it allowed us to rewrite that energy I showed you on the last slide that had those red terms in it, like this. Okay, so why is this a big deal? So this energy consists of the classical shell theory that Coiter wrote down 70 years ago, plus this new term. We got rid of all those A bars and B bars, things that we didn't know what to do with, and we ended up with this new term that kind of has some constant, some geometric property. Our stimulus, which is curva, so the kappa, that's how much we're curving the structure, and then some term here that we'll talk about in a second. The reason why this was really helpful and insightful to us is it allowed us to split that energy into something that we know how to deal with. An elastic energy, we know how to deal with elastic energy, and this looks like a potential. This is kind of like, we think about potentials all the time in elasticity. We think about force being conjugate to displacement, or pressure being work conjugate to changes in volume of a structure. And what we found here was that this stimulus, kappa, is work conjugate to something that measures how curvatures change on the overall structure. Okay, we're going to come back to making some more sense of this. This is probably, in my opinion, the thing that was most important that came out of this work is basically arriving here and then physically interpreting what this quantity means, which we're going to do in a minute. So the first thing we did is once we arrived at this energy, we went back and solved an old problem to make sure that we knew what we were doing. And that old problem is the bilayer plate problem. So you take a plate that has a bilayer, the top layer is going to grow, the bottom layer is going to shrink, and we ask, what's the shape going to be? We try to grow this thing into a sphere. We know that it can't form a sphere, so we know that it's going to form some sort of cylindrical-like shape. We measure this shape here by its mean curvature. So the mean curvature is take the average of the curvature in this direction and the curvature in this direction. And so we can solve this problem. We write down our energy that I showed you before with our potential. We say, we know that it can't stretch. And whenever you have a mechanics problem in which you know something needs to be constrained, you constrain that property with a Lagrange multiplier. So we take this energy, we constrain the Gaussian curvature not to change, and we minimize the energy. And what we find is if you minimize this energy, you get an analytical expression for the mean curvature of this cylinder as a function of the natural curvature, kind of whatever the stimulus is doing. And how we do this in the lab to confirm this measurement is we take a bilayer plate, doesn't matter the shape, a square, pentagon, circle, doesn't matter. And then we take a beam that's exactly the same shape, and we measure the curvature of this beam. And what this equation says is that the mean curvature of this shell should be 3/4 the natural curvature of this beam. It kind of looks weird, right? It kind of looks the opposite, doesn't it? It looks like this thing is actually more curved than this one. But that's because, remember, that mean curvature is the average of the curvature in this direction and 0. And so this is why this one, the mean curvature here is actually lower than this one here. So this confirmed it. And this was really the first kind of thing we were able to figure out. And the reason why this is important is because this problem had been solved. It came about in the 80s for laminate composite plates. You take a fiberglass composite, you put some epoxy on it, you do a poor job of curing it in the oven, and it warps. Okay, what do you do? Well, this problem had been solved with laminate composites for some very basic shapes, circular shapes, square shapes. And what this allowed us to do is to solve it for any kind of shape that you can dream up. Whether it's a pentagon, this is the letter T, a triangle, any shape will follow this law between how curvature relates to the natural curvature of the object. So once we understood this, we moved on to more complex structures like a shell. So here's a bilayer shell where the outside of this layer wants to get bigger, the inside of this layer wants to shrink, We let residual swelling impart a natural curvature stimuli on it, and we watch how it deforms. And this looks kind of familiar, right? This kind of looks like that pollen grain folding that we saw before, in which you had a spherical shell that was subjected to a natural curvature that kind of wrapped up into this like spindle-like shape here. In fact, to go from this spherical shell to this shape here, this thing buckles. If you switch the stimulus and you put the shrinking part on the outside and the growing part on the inside, you switch the instability. You completely change the instability. As we let natural curvature swell this structure, what you find, if you wait long enough, is that your structure snaps. This kind of looks just like that Volvox video I showed you before, in which you have natural curvature acting on a shell, you get to a certain critical point, and this thing completely flips itself inside out. So in order to understand this, we have to do a little bit of math and try to make sense of what's happening here. So we have to write this potential here, which we could handle for a flat plate, but is not so trivial for a spherical shell. And what we do is we expand this term here in terms of the displacements of the shell. So this term here is the normal displacement, and this term here is a vector that describes the in-plane displacements. What's really nice is that you kind of look at this thing and you say, well, I have a term that corresponds to the displacement. I have a divergence here. I have a Laplacian here. A Laplacian is the divergence of a gradient. If I have all these divergences, I can apply the divergence theorem and move these quantities out to the boundaries. And that allows us to take this term here that's not really physically obvious what it means and split it into two components. Something that's working entirely in the bulk, that comes mainly from this term, and something that's working from the edge. We split this here, and we can physically understand what this potential means. And what this potential means is that natural curvature is trying to do two things. It's trying to act like a pressure in the bulk, and it's trying to act like a torque on the edges. This really helped us understand what these structures are doing. And in particular, if you just compare the work that's acting like a torque to the work that's acting like a pressure, what you find is that if your shell has a boundary, the work that's acting like a torque is completely dominant. It's the only thing that matters. The work that's acting like a pressure doesn't enter the problem at all. And this is really useful. It allowed us to develop an entire phase map, kind of a general formulation of the whole problem from flat plates to really, really deep spherical shells. So there's a lot on here, so let me quickly take you through it. This limit over here tells you when a flat plate will buckle into a cylindrical shape. If you start with your shell here and you turn down the natural curvature, it tells you that you will buckle into a spindle-like shape based on a relationship that describes what the area of the plate is relative to the perimeter. Why does that matter? Because you're applying a torque to the perimeter, so the amount of perimeter you have is the main thing in the problem. And then if you look up here, if you start here and you apply a natural curvature that's positive, you'll kind of deform like a little mushroom, and then eventually you'll snap. And depending on where you are, you'll either snap axisymmetrically or you'll snap into a little pollen grain shape here. So why do you care about this? Well, one thing is one of the most promising ways to make actively morphing structures is to use voltage as your stimulus. And voltage can impart a natural curvature just like anything else. If you take a dielectric elastomers and you, for instance, make a tri-layer where you stretch the dielectric elastomer one way here, and you kind of mount it into a stiff middle layer, this will cause this structure to buckle. So we're looking here at simulations of this type of structure buckling into a bistable shell. The amount of stimulus you need to get it to buckle dictates how curved your shell is going to be. And so we can use that phase map that I showed you on the last slide to predict the shape of our bistable shell. And that's important for this reason. If you want to create a bistable shell that can snap between two configurations, the amount of voltage you need to give it to snap depends on how curved it is in the first place. So the amount of voltage here goes up with the amount of curvature your shell is. And so these are simulations that show how this bistable shell will snap as we apply this voltage to it. In collaboration with our Tusher Gaussian at NC State, we're now experimentally realizing these bistable structures. This kind of looks like a snap bracelet, because it's exactly what it is. It's the snapping of a cylindrical shell. If you make one axis of that cylindrical shell really long, it becomes a snap bracelet. And so the mechanics of this are completely guided by the buckling that takes to form this shape and the snapping, which takes to trigger this shape and does allow us to make bistable electrically active materials. Why do you want that? Electrically active materials are really promising for morphing structures. However, in order to morph a structure with voltage, the voltage has to be applied continuously. High voltage continuously applied to maintain a deformation. So what people are after now is, how can we apply a voltage for a short amount of time to trigger a shape change, turn the voltage off, and we've just deformed our structure? And so we're using this kind of fundamental framework for natural curvature now to study how to use voltage to make morphable structures. So this is what happens when your shell is open. What happens when your shell is closed? Well, we talked about how the edge work is completely dominant over the bulk work. But if there's no edge, then that doesn't matter at all. And all you're left with is that bulk term. This is analogous now to the pressure buckling of a spherical shell. You apply a positive pressure to the outside, this shell buckles. You apply a positive natural curvature, this shell buckles. So can we understand this buckling process by looking at this term here? And if you study shell mechanics, you would know that this term that's in this integral here is exactly identical to what you find when you have pressure acting on a spherical shell. The pressure acts to normally displace this shell. And this is great because now you can, for instance, say before buckling, the behavior of these spherical shells under curvature stimuli is exactly the same as the behavior of spherical shells under pressure stimuli. And so you can confirm this here with a graph that shows that the displacement of the shell completely matches what you would find from pressure. This is nice because it allows you to connect these two seemingly different things, pressure and curvature, with this analogy that as your curvature goes up, it's kind of analogous to the pressure of your shell going up. However, and this is a kind of an important moment, this would tell you that I can just use the pressure buckling case to predict when this thing should buckle under curvature. This is a classical problem that dates back over 100 years ago to when a shell will buckle under pressure. But this is where kind of things can go very wrong. We learned buckling as engineers in usually one framework, which is the Euler buckling of a beam. And this is kind of a very misleading way to learn about buckling, because you make a very important assumption at the beginning in which that you say that this structure is incompressible. And then you write down your strain energy, you write down the work being done to it, and you solve this eigenvalue problem to figure out what load will cause this thing to buckle. That's a very misleading way, because that's not actually what tells you when a structure will buckle. What tells you when a structure will buckle is the state of stress in the material as it's being deformed. And that's very, very different. And the reason that's very, very, very different is because this structure is only under a membrane state of stress, where this structure is under a membrane and a curvature stress. If you use this analogy to predict when this shell will buckle, you'll get a result that, as we say in science, is not even wrong. It will not only predict the wrong magnitude of your stimulus, but it will actually tell you that you should flip the sign. It's like as if you said, when will this thing buckle? It'll buckle when I pull on it. It's completely wrong. And so if you don't consider the proper state of stress before buckling, in your stability analysis, you'll completely miss this buckling instability. Why does this matter? Okay, well, shell buckling is one of the probably most frustrating problems in all of structural mechanics, because you write down this beautiful equation over 100 years ago, and you find out that it does an absolutely horrendous job at predicting when real-life structures buckle. Here is the ratio of the radius to the thickness of a shell, and if that equation did really well, all of these data points would be on this line. And they're clearly not, and there's like no systematic way to predict what this will happen. This is what's known as a knockdown factor. It basically is a fudge factor that says, oh, you're making a spherical shell, just overestimate how much this thing will buckle by maybe an order of 80, 20, 40%, And we'll just put that in our calculations and then say, that's when this thing will buckle. What's interesting now is you have this analogy between pressure and curvature. As pressure goes up, that's like saying, well, we could say that curvature going up does the same thing. So now we could imagine coupling these effects, and as we turn pressure up, we could imagine turning curvature down. So we put these two things together, and instead of a knockdown factor, our initial results suggest that we can actually get a knock-up factor. So what you're plotting here is the amount of curvature needed to buckle a shell. If you apply them both in the same direction, you're basically trying to buckle the shell with pressure and trying to buckle the shell with curvature. It's obviously going to be incredibly weak. It's going to buckle at really, really low values. But if you turn down the curvature and turn up the pressure, we might actually be able to make more rigid shells that can highly resist buckling, just by kind of coupling these two effects here and kind of canceling out the pressure. And so that's why this analogy is really important. We've done some preliminary experiments that show this in fact actually works. So you can measure this knockdown factor very, very precisely as a function of time, which is kind of a stand-in for curvature here. And we show that if we turn up the pressure, the knockdown factor goes down. If we turn up the curvature, the knockdown factor goes down. If we turn down the curvature, the knockdown factor goes up. And so we're starting to make kind of self-healing shells. I'm going to skip my last two parts here and just kind of cut right to my summary, which is I want you to take away three things. One is, if you have a stimulus that tries to change the curvature of an object, we can treat this as a curvature potential. And that physically means that curvature stimulus is trying to apply a torque to the edges and apply a pressure to the bulk. The second thing I want you to take away is that in response to this stimuli, these thin structures will adopt an isometric deformation. Isometric means no stretching. So a flat plate will try to go towards a cylinder. It's not obvious, but trust me when I say that a spherical shell, an isometric deformation is this weird spindle-like geometry here. And the third thing is that just by changing the sign of this curvature stimulus, you can trigger fundamentally different instabilities. Whereas a negative curvature will trigger buckling, and a positive curvature can trigger a snap-through instability. This is a really slow, continuous instability. This is a very, very rapid, discontinuous instability. These results are true for any thin shell of any arbitrary shape, ellipsoids, pick your shape, saddles, whatever complicated thing you can dream up. We've demonstrated here with very simple shapes because these are mathematically tractable, but it's robust beyond these simple shapes here. So where do we go from here? And I kind of want to take us back to the beginning of the talk and to kind of show you a couple examples of where I imagine this stuff going. One is furthering this idea of shape-shifting structures, patterning shapes that can transform localized stress, cause patterns that can kind of move or distort around the structure as we actively apply a stimulus to them. We're looking at dynamic morphing, which is to take kind of non-traditional bistable structures and trigger instabilities that cause them to change shape, for instance, by, in this case, dynamically exciting them. And we're looking towards kind of designing, I forgot to pass around some of these. We're looking towards designing shapes. There you go. I kind of think of it as like digitizing them, where you have local regions, kind of unit cells that can stretch or bend. And if you can kind of tunably change the strain in those little regions there, you can kind of tunably prescribe a shape change. So this is in the shape-shifting component of our work. This is the stuff that we just focused on. Another main thrust that we're going in goes back to this elastogranular problem, which is there's still so much fundamentally we don't understand about simple questions with elastic and granular interactions. Like, how do you pack an elastic structure into a granular array? If you're so far from equilibrium because this granular array is jammed and in a random state, how do materials relax in these configurations? And we hope that the insights from this will allow us to design kind of pourable structures or reversible structures that are completely formed by interactions between elastic structures and fragile matter. And finally, going back to the first thing we talked about, this kirigami, We're interested in creating mechanical metamaterials that allow us to, for instance, get tunable material properties. So here's an example of shapes where this is kind of one shape here. This is a second shape, and if you kind of poke on them, you can actually switch this shape to something that looks like this shape. So why does that matter? Because this shape, if you saw as it was getting passed around, is significantly stiffer than this shape, and you can see it here. You know, when this shape here corresponds to this shape here, it can hold this 500-gram mass much higher than when you switch it to this shape here. So this is the same material, same cuts. All we did was just trigger an instability, and we made this thing be able to kind of lift a massive amount of weight. So that might provide a new way to get kind of a muscular-like actuation. And we're going to try to move these ideas towards kind of curved shell-like structures and ways to kind of move waves and instabilities around complex materials. So in summary, I want to thank the people who actually did the work, which are all my graduate students and postdocs. In particular, we focused kind of in this top part up here today for today's talk, but a lot of the elastogranular work was done by Jay Shunter and the Kirigami work by Yi Yang. With that, I would happily take any questions you might have.
Go ahead, go.
So when you're stiffening your spherical shell against buckling,
Yeah.
which curvature are you adjusting?
We adjust the natural curvature of the shell. So what that means is we apply a stimulus that will locally, yeah, perfect. You can imagine I have this thing clamped at its edges, and I apply a stimulus that locally tries to make this point on the material bend a little bit more.
So the two principal curvatures are equal for a sphere, right?
They are, but when you change the natural curvature of the shell, that's like basically saying, okay, here's my sphere. It's got some shape here. I'm going to apply a stimulus that is going to try to change the curvature of this shell. What you can imagine doing is imagine cutting a thin strip out of this material and looking at how that thin strip changes. If you cut the material out from its original shell, it'll have the exact same curvature as the principal curvature of the shell. But if you change the natural curvature of that, what you'll find is if you cut that strip out, it's actually going to try to bend more. And so this is going to essentially kind of be hardening this material by trying to have it curve more, but now it's fixed at its edges and it really can't. It would change the Gaussian curvature if it could, I guess.
I have a bunch of questions because we're thinking a lot about how to go from two-dimensional to three-dimensional in terms of fabrication of scaffolding structures for cells. So I'm interested in how well you can practically predict the end shapes of some of these structures. And also, I wonder at what length scale does this theory break down?
How well we can predict them, I think very well. Analytically, like with an actual formula, it depends on the shape. And it depends on if you can learn anything. If you want something that's a complex shape, can you learn anything from maybe a unit cell in that shape? But numerically, we are able to implement this for complex shapes, and we're working with Harold Park and their computational mechanics expertise to be able to use this approach to monitor, to predict the shape changes of thin structures of kind of arbitrary shapes, small strains, large strains. So I would say to the first answer, pretty well. We have a pretty good ability to predict the shape of these structures. The flip of that, which is how do we design a shape change, not so well. And that's what we're after. And so Paul and Harold and I have been kind of pursuing this idea of how do you design, here's your target shape, how do you get there? Do you get there using an instability? Do you get there going around instability? And we don't know how to do that yet. To the second part, when does this stuff break down? I think you'd have to get really small because it's a continuum theory, so it's gonna break down whenever you would expect the continuum models of shell theories or plate theories to break down. But if you were there for David Nelson's talk, they're basically using a simplified version of this shell model, which would be the von Karman plate theory, to predict kind of graphene configurations. And so, and the reason why I think that works is because the dominant length scales there are lateral and not thickness. And so I think you can get really small.
So, with this theoretical background, does it also explain the topology change, for example, from a spherical shape to a donut kind of shape?
Oh, that's a great question.
When you think about Gaussian curvature, you may think about the topology change between these two.
No, this is a really good question. And this is something that we're actively thinking about. Where does my... And the short answer is we really don't understand what topology is doing to this problem yet at all. It's adding another constraint. It's in the limit of that, for instance, that cylinder going down towards a really, really flat cylinder. It starts to behave like a ring. In the limit of that cylinder becoming really, really long, it starts to behave like what's called a pinch in a pipe. So if you take a cylindrical shell and you pinch it, so how long does that pinch propagate? As you get towards more complicated cylinders in which the radius gets a lot larger, it's really, really complex because you no longer have one minimum energy state. You have bistable structures, as you're seeing in this video there. So the role of topology is a good question, and it's an open question. It's something that, that Lucia, who's sitting near you, is currently thinking about. So, yeah.
Those flat plane things that the cuts
Yeah.
you passed around, I know we could predict how they're going to behave with, say, a stress and strain NPA type program, but it'd be painful to carry out, Do you know if anyone's working on making more, like here you are just pulling it like this and the things rotating and doing interesting things. NPA, it would take a while, Is anyone working on developing something that, it could be developed and used to be able to, aid in your insight as to what's going on?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we are. And I actually can give you some good insight on how this works right now. We've done a lot of work, and I can talk about that, happily talk about it offline. But the basic principle is if you have a cut in the middle of a sheet and you pull on it, that will generate lift in the material. If you have a cut on the edge of a sheet, that will generate a rotation in the material. And so then you can start to say, okay, if I have something that's going to generate lift near something that's going to generate rotation, you can start to kind of imagine kind of little unit cells that you put together that should deform in certain ways. And we can tell you, based on the arrangement of those unit cells, it has to do with just the geometry of the cuts, whether or not what's near that cell will lift or rotate, and we can tell you what plane it'll rotate about. And so we do a lot of, when we analyze those structures, we do finite element analysis, we do experiments, but we also are trying to come up with geometric arguments that tell you what you should expect to see. And so we have a decent understanding, but just for that basic understanding, a cut that is not near the boundaries will cause the internal part of it to lift, and a cut that's near the boundaries will generate rotation. And from those two things, you can start to piece together how these things should deform. A really excellent BU undergraduate, Mike McCarran, figured all of that out. And so he deserves a lot of the credit for that.
Okay, I think I'm going to close it, and anyone else who's got questions, feel free to stay on or find Professor Holmes in his office in St. Mary's. And we also actually did tape this, so it's available for classes if anyone's interested.
It's going to go viral.
It's not being posted on. All right, so let's thank. I hope that you absolutely exploded my faces.
Haha. Thanks.
Really nice.
Excellent.
Very hard.
I'm happy to chat.